Thank you very much, Craig, and thanks for the opportunity to feedback on the OHDSI Europe Symposium from the 24th to 26th, so since Friday to Sunday over the weekend. A huge number of people are involved in organising this and holding the meeting, and I can only represent my particular perspective on that, which I'll try to give as broadly as I can today. But really, this is on behalf of the OHDSI Europe group. It's just unfortunate Peter Reinbeck and a number of colleagues aren't able to make today's community call, but hopefully I will be able to substitute in that stead. So I'm going to cover this kind of through the agenda, really. So through the 3 days and some highlights through those 3 days agenda, and pick out various topics. If anyone wants to jump in and with any comments and so forth, you're also welcome. Not just to reduce the monotony of hearing my voice. But without further ado, just to hopefully you can see the image there of Peter and his team, mainly from Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam. All of them, well, majority of them contractually obliged, I think, now to wear the same T-shirts. But they did a tremendous job organising the 3-day event in 2 different venues and very different agendas on each day, as we'll see. Fantastic job. This is a combination of wanting to meet, of course, like all of us, together in person for some time now, but with the pandemic, of course, we all know what happened there. Originally, we were supposed to have the last symposia was going to be in 2020, was in Oxford, cancelled, of course, due to the start of the pandemic, and commuted into the, well, now historical, really, I suppose, and remarkable COVID-19 study-a-thon that was held in March 2020 instead of the Oxford Symposium. And we've now come back to the first live face-to-face symposium back in Rotterdam, and hopefully a start of a series of these on an annual basis going forward in different venues, hopefully back to Oxford and then various other places beyond that. So congratulations to the team. The first venue was this ship, the SS Rotterdam, which is also known as the Grand Dame. It's a former ocean liner and cruise ship. It's moored now; it doesn't go anywhere. It's moored in Rotterdam. It used to apply its trade between the Netherlands and United States, New York, since the late 50s onwards, from about 59, I think, until she was finally retired in September 2000, and is now used as a hotel and conference venue. And we actually have now been there twice because we had the launch of the Eden program in late 2018 on board the SS Rotterdam, and it was fantastic to be able to come back to this venue for the first day, which we'll see of the symposium, and then the rest of the weekend was at Erasmus Medical Center and the Education Center there. I learned something from Johan van der Leij about this ship, which is not in Wikipedia, and it's quite confusing, like apparently all cruise liners are, to find your way around. But apparently that's on purpose, so that the first class passengers very rarely, if any at all, see the second and third class passengers in the rest of the ship. And it's designed in a way that hopefully the first class passengers never bump into anyone that are beneath them, not just in the ship, but in social standing. So quite an interesting finding. I didn't know that, but was informed that from Johan van der Leij in conversation. But packed out, I think, specifically in the first day or so by us in the OHDSI meeting. So just a few facts and figures. There were around 350 delegates, so the highest yet so far for the European meeting, and from around the world as well, not just within Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, United States, all over the place. Fantastic. 24 plenary presentations, about 80 posters. Again, all of this is a record. There's an exhibitor showcase of companies, small to medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, so small tech firms, if you like, and projects as well. There was a full-day workshop, which we'll talk about in a bit, the myocarditis characterization study led by Patrick and others. There were 8 work group and/or special interest sessions as well. Actually, on the third day, we had a data partner SME community lunch on the Sunday as well, and a whole kind of community aboard ship at the SS Rotterdam and Erasmus MC very much focused on, well, beyond the common data model, and particularly focused on evidence generation. And I won't spoil it, but there were some particular themes and takeaways that came out from this year's meeting, which I think are fantastic testimony to the work, so much work and so much diverse work being carried out in Europe by our colleagues, many of whom have now mapped their own data sets, for instance, to the common data model. But this particular focused on evidence generation, if you like, the payoff for having done all the hard work of mapping to the common data model, and now going on to generate evidence at scale, individually or across the network. So may not be able to see all of this, but I'll go through this in much more detail. So the day one was the symposium, day two was the workshop, and day three was the work groups, the special interest sessions, and so on. Peter welcomed everyone on board, so to speak, at the start. But George, well, I suppose a traditional intro presentation really on from George Ribstrack on where have we been, and also where are we going in terms of the journey of Odyssey. And I think just really historically outlining the enormous progress that's been made, not just in terms of the tool, skills, and methods development, the evidence generation, the evolution of the common data model, of course, but also as a community, globally, of course, and internationally as an open science collaborative network. And also, as noted by a number of key performance indicators, if you like, or outputs, but particularly things like our publications, which have risen quite robustly year on year and over time, again, adding to the wealth of evidence in the literature and so forth, and particularly in high impact journals. And of course, quite typified really in the last few years with the response to COVID-19, which is still ongoing, of course. There's still research studies from that COVID-19 study-a-thon in March 2020, but also in terms of ongoing studies and so forth, allied to COVID-19, linked to the vaccines, to safety and adverse events, and also into things like long COVID, of course, unfortunately for many who have continued illness due to being infected with SARS coronavirus 2. So a really excellent start to kind of setting the scene, I suppose, globally in terms of Odyssey and OMOP. And we're going to go into much more depth in a moment, but we had a session I moderated around the cruise around the Odyssey Europe community. That was 10 countries, each given 5 minutes to present on their own experiences. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then rounding off the first half of the day, and we'll go through this a bit more depth as well, a rapid fire presentation of collaborators moderated by Katia Verhammer in Erasmus again. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the sessions around, as Craig mentioned, the launch of the Eden Data Partner catalog within the Eden portal, and our showcase and so forth a bit later in the coverage of the session. If we go to the first session, oops, excuse me. So we had 10 countries, all of whom had been accepted for a poster, but we wanted to give them a chance for an oral presentation. So 5 minutes each, as it were, to present on what was happening in their particular country, what they were doing in terms of working within the Odyssey framework, using the OMOP common data model, standardized analytical pipeline, and evidence generation alone or in collaboration with others, and kind of pick out some particular themes, if you like, that emanated from this whole collection of these individual countries, which I'm going to go through in a bit more depth in a moment. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it may be moving or not, I'm sure, on the Teams. But that was a short video of Maria Kolesnik, who was from Ukraine. And remarkably, one of the 10 countries was colleagues from Ukraine. You can obviously see that in the middle there, integration prospects to Ukrainian healthcare system with OMOP common data model, considering the awful circumstances currently ongoing, really, in Ukraine with the war with Russia. Quite remarkable that Maria was able to present, but there was just actually very emotional, I think, and very emotive point in this whole session around support for Ukraine and our Ukrainian colleagues, and a standing ovation, I think, from all of the audience, which is really poignant, but I think reinforcing again that despite actually so many challenges and some way beyond any expectations control we have, particularly military actions, um, work can continue. It's astonishing. And people continue to work on doing things like ETLs of data sets and working and collaborating with data partners, even as Maria was saying, practically under shelling. So just astonishing, but certainly puts things into context in our world, in our lives, as it were, in terms in terms of what we're all doing. So we had presentations at the top here from our colleagues in Estonia who are mapping various different data sets to the OMOP common data model in a kind of long tail effect. So not all of their data sets and not all of each data set, but aspects of their data sets, like, for instance, data around asthma, as an example, for instance, infectious diseases and various others, but really leading them to be able to do research studies going from clinical insights through to things like public health, for instance, studies around human papillomavirus prevalence within Estonia, and again, all rounding off because they're now standardizing and organizing their data, of course, using the OMOP common data model. Across the border in Finland, in FinOMOP, as it's known, there's a Finnish OMOP data network now, an actually expansive a collection of around 6 or 7 large-scale hospitals and others that have formed a network, or indeed what we're now calling a node, I suppose, in terms of OHDSI within Europe, and who are all actively mapping their data to the common data model. A number of them with Eden and support from Eden, as it were, but looking to create a network that allows them to start running studies, of course, and generate evidence, both in terms of areas of clinical interest, as well as, again, around areas that are linked to public health and policy and so forth. So quite remarkable, I think, in terms of actually a short space of time, really, actually the span of the pandemic, I'd say, we're starting to see countries forming these networks as well, and starting to self-organize, again, all commonly because they're mapping their own data sets individually to the common data model, but they're sharing that experience, learning, and also involvement with other third parties like SMEs who have been trained and certified in doing this ETL, say, for instance, with Eden. And then just south of that in Denmark, and many of us have been familiar with previous talks from our Danish Surgical Centre colleagues in the area of colorectal cancer, but fantastic overview, again, of the sheer amount of work that's been done over several years now in mapping to common data model, but really to support predictive modelling at a clinical coalface to assist clinicians in terms of decision making for regarding colorectal cancer and surgical intervention. And this is really a remarkable use case, which I think many people are pointing to as an example of what can be achieved, incorporating many of the aspects we're also all used to, whether it's from ETL right through to prediction modelling and federated learning. So again, a lot to be learned from our Scandinavian colleagues in this area and so forth, and then leading on to Norway, where they're mapping a whole series of national registries to the common data model. It's a common phenomena in Scandinavia, same in Sweden as well. But in particular, one area that's highlighted here with our Norwegian colleagues was the focus on pregnancy studies, and they now have a cohort of around 720,000 pregnancies that are in a mapped data set that they can link through a national identifier to other data sets, of course, as well, which is also very interesting in terms of wider context and in terms of health and disease and comorbidities and so forth as well. But a very large scale data set which they are aiming to link up here in Europe. We're actually talking together now, promoting interoperability now with our Norwegian colleagues and the pregnancy study and the registries with other Eden data partners who would potentially have pregnancy data as well, and amplifying, if you like, that cohort. And this is, again, a very common theme here, I think, is that once you've mapped your data to the common data model, there's kind of a large scale amplification effect, if you like, that can occur going forward in terms of what you can do in terms of evidence generation, but how you might be able to do that in terms of collaboration in these larger scale networks and more rapid studies and so forth as well. So fascinating just in terms of the Scandinavian area. I'm going to zip through a few of the others, but not all, just because of time. But particularly our German colleagues, our Italian colleagues, and our Greek colleagues all three countries, all focused on creating national networks, multiple centres, hospitals, and other data sets that are being mapped to a common data model currently mostly through the Eden programme. Germany had their own medical informatics initiative, MII, with various regional networks, but all now really creating national initiatives, and again, OHDSI nodes within Europe, centred around the commonality of mapping to the CDM, but also looking at common interests from a research perspective locally and within their countries, but also then linking up obviously within the regional network, and hence within OHDSI Europe and Eden. I already mentioned Ukrainian colleagues, who was just astonishing that Cyforce, which was the SME who was certified and trained and working with local data sets in Ukraine through Eden, are continuing to do work despite the challenges that they're facing every day. And then on to countries like Israel, talking about again really working to map the whole EHR within one district in Galilee, which is looking at longitudinal data as well, from the birth to death. So little turnover in terms of movement of patients from that area. Very interesting. Lots of fascination around Israeli data as a consequence, but really wanting to create a large-scale network, and indeed looking to create a national network over time of Israeli centres mapped to the CDM, and very similar to the other countries. And probably furthest in advance was at the bottom here was France, with their Health Data Hub, which is actually enshrined in French legislation. It's an official body, if you like, where they're mapping lots of data sets, including the national claims data set, SNDS, 60 million people, to the common data model. Initially started in and around COVID-19, but now expanding beyond that into other therapeutic areas. But this is a remarkable story in itself, just in France, of working at this at a national scale, as it were, but looking to organise data nationally and support data access, standardized analytics, and evidence generation, both within France, but also internationally with other collaborators outside of France. And so really the CDM is really a means to an end in terms of key themes. Evidence generation for local and international needs is growing rapidly, and this is kind of payoff, and it's illustrating that we're already starting to see the impact of a lot of the work that's been ongoing for the last number of years. Key for many was funding and also SME support. Those are trained and certified small to medium-sized enterprises under Eden were very integral to a lot of the work in kind of industrializing mapping to the common data model here within Europe. It's certainly from the bedside to public health. Many countries are starting to organise international nodes, and these are some examples. There are others. And it's very much a long tail approach to ETL. So it's not trying to necessarily always ETL or map every scrap of data from day one, but actually various different data sets over time, and adding to that as people go in terms of evidence generation. So I spent quite a bit of time on this, but this was a really well-received session and very insightful, I think, in terms of all the different countries and so forth that were represented across the European region, from Norway down to Israel. I don't know if we want to take any quick points before I move on in the rest of the agenda, or any other questions. We could do that.
Anybody have any questions? This was a really great session, a great recap, Nige. But does anybody have any questions specifically about the presentations from the different European countries? Again, you may come up with them later. I'm just not sure exactly how much time we'll have at the end for like a full Q&A. So if there's specific questions about this session, maybe just raise your hand.
Okay, if not,
okay, let's move on. Yep.
Okay, silence is good or bad. So, oh, let's get out of here. Yep, we'll come out of that. Okay, so I'm just going to pick out a few highlights just because of time, but this was the rapid fire presentations that were the second half of the morning, if you like, into the afternoon, with moderated by Katia. And just to pick out a few of these, and forgive me if I didn't pick out, and if you're on the call, your particular one. But for instance, number 3 there, the OMAP mapping of real-world data from Brazil and Pakistan towards management of COVID-19 in the global south. I mean, it's a remarkable collaboration between datasets and colleagues in Pakistan and Brazil and in Oxford. University of Oxford in Danny Prito Hambra's group, but really illustrating again how we can use the very transferable technologies, methods, tools and skills that we have in Odyssey into different settings, and in particular, in areas where, like low and middle income countries and so forth, but there are maybe more resource constrained, as it were. And these were very large scale data sets, particularly in Pakistan and in Brazil, pointing to clinical insights around the natural history and progression of COVID-19 within these different populations, but also extremely interesting from a comparative point of view between two extremely different settings in terms of Pakistan and Brazil. But again, and I think a very prevalent theme, of course, is remarkable also because of the shortness of time, maybe one should say, it took to organize this and to pull this together, which I think is a phenomenon, of course, we're used to maybe in Odyssey, but maybe others are not so used to outside of Odyssey. But certainly in terms of rising to the need during a pandemic, it's been illustrated time and time again in terms of the time saving, if nothing else, in terms of these collaborations and being able to work with data at scale very rapidly to do the rapid analysis. Another very interesting one, I think, pointing to other areas of work within Odyssey and with colleagues in and outside of the Odyssey community for the future is in health technology assessment. Growing in the United States as a phenomenon, of course, but quite embedded here in many countries in Europe. And our colleagues from NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in England, and they're a partner in Eden as well, published a very nice overview of the rise in need for real-world evidence to make assessment decisions around new health technologies. So that's new pharmaceutical agents, new medical devices, and so on, that will be introduced into the healthcare system and would need to be reimbursed, of course, and supported longer term in a given population for a given disease area, for instance. And there is a very clear shift, particularly from using RCT data, which is kind of curious for health technology assessments, which are focusing on the real world, so to speak, in terms of post-authorization, but actually now more interested in being able to utilize real world data and generate real world evidence. But that's bringing other challenges, particularly methodological, in terms of HTA. But indeed, quite a lot of work ongoing now, particularly driven by our NICE and other colleagues around methodological development and utilization of use cases to reinforce the opportunity to use real world data and generate real evidence for this type of decision making, which is really integral now to a lot of healthcare provision in many countries internationally. And then we moved to someone like Anique Marcus, who actually this is the first time she was giving a talk to such a large group. Did brilliantly in this context, where she was looking at why predictive risk can't identify risk factors. So empirical assessment of model stability and machine learning across observational health databases. It may sound obvious or not, but certainly to me, one of the take homes is you have to be incredibly wary of the types of data sets that have been used in that predictive modeling, as it were, because quite clearly that can have an impact on your results of your predictive model and on the terms and in terms of the outputs in terms of the prediction, which has an impact then on trying to identify risk factors. And actually, depending on the data set, same or similar models can have very varied and different results in terms of that risk factor prediction, and it's something that we need to be guarded about. But as we've heard, and I think particularly from Peter's group to date, from a number of presentations in the symposium, but also prior to that in some publications from Anique and from Cynthia Yang and many others, that indeed, there are some caveats. There are some things we need to consider quite carefully in terms of machine and federated learning, transparent AI, and so forth, in terms of what we're expecting them to achieve. And then Jamie Weaver presented on analytical space for quantitative bias analysis in pharmacoepidemiology, which is really a very vexed area of epidemiology and requiring kind of renewed attention, which I think was a very big thrust from Jamie's presentation. And then right through to actually colleagues from Novo Nordisk, pharmaceutical company, who are utilizing the analytical tools developed within Odyssey to evaluate or support the validation of safety signals. And this was an initial feasibility study, which was very positive in terms of utilizing the Odyssey research framework to support safety signals, as it were, within relation to the use of their own product in this context. And I think fascinating that they were happy and very keen to present this. I'll talk a bit more about the database catalog in a moment. Just to say, there were 80 posters in the OHDSI Collaborators Showcase, which is a new high, from data standards and management, open source analytics development, clinical applications, and methodological research. I do have, and I know Craig, you're going to post these slides after, but I have a listing of those posters. We're not going to be able to go through those today, and certainly not one by one. But I may highlight a couple as we go through later. But just to mention, that was a really strong input into of the science into the meeting. And then if it lets me go. Just very quickly, a quick plug. I hope most of you are familiar with EDEN, European Health Data and Evidence Network, that Peter and I are co-coordinating. Our colleague Julia Kurtz from the Hive, well-known SME Europe and internationally within the project, was involved as she's involved in work package 4, which is a lot of the architectural development within the project. And she presented on the launch of what is known as the EDEN portal, that is the central part or compartment of the EDEN architecture to allow fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data, of course, with data discovery right through to the study workflow and standardized analytics and so forth as well. And we took the opportunity in the symposium on Friday to launch the database catalog and the network dashboards, these two up top here, which are now live. If you go to portal.eden.eu, you can enroll if you haven't done already, get an account, and you can start looking through the database catalog, which, you're right, Craig, will show eventually all of our data partners. It doesn't currently yet. There's about 66 data partners of the 140 we're currently working with, and we've got more to come. And of those, about half are mapped to the common data model, and so they are able to fuel these network dashboards, as it were, and database catalog dashboards, partner dashboards around feasibility. So getting a much more granular insight. And then various other aspects will become available later this year. The build didn't work on the slides, never mind, which will be around the standardized analytical tools and the study workflow, as I mentioned, going through the remainder of this year and into next year, as it were. But ultimately, you should be able to go from discoverability of data partners and required data sets to collaborate with, all the way through to conducting analyses and having your results and going through things like publication and so forth through this overall portal, which will be a great, remarkable achievement, central to what we're trying to do within EDEN, of course, but also importantly mixing the collaboration with our data partners and making them findable. So this was launched, as I say, on Friday. It's now public, so it's not just for EDEN; it's for anybody globally, actually, in the research community, and clearly for anyone within the OHDSI community. And in time, we will want to see this extended, even beyond the confines of Europe, internationally. I think there's a lot of interest in utilizing this type of architecture. So I'm going to move from there, just a few screenshots. So this is if you were just looking in at the database catalog, and you can see all the various data sets and so forth. These are just some of the ones that are available, of course, just an overview, some quick details, populations and geography and so forth, but you can click on each of these individual ones, go through to things like a fingerprint browser, gives you an overall profile and various metadata that's attached to each of the data partners and so forth as well. And then there's the database dashboards and so on, and just very quick schematics. There is much more to it than that, but just because of time. But you get these database level dashboards, as it were, that are all running off the back of the CDM, of course, informing these within the dashboards, and you can move across into demographics, the data domains, data provenance, observation periods, visits, concept browser, and so forth. To get granular insights into that data set that's been mapped to the common data model, which we are often not afforded to be able to do when we're trying to work out who do we want to collaborate with, what kind of data do you have, and is this relevant to my research hypothesis or query and so forth. And so this is where we hope the start of going to be a very well used tool. So it's publicly available. Anyone can go on there right now. Just go to portal.eden.eu, or just go to eden.eu or to the news item, as Craig mentioned, on odyssey.org, and you can get through to the appropriate link, request an account, free, enroll, and then start to use this type of tooling at scale. And this will only get better, of course, as our data partners complete their mapping and complete all of their input into these dashboards, into the catalog. So I was going to move on from there. I'm going to briefly mention there were a number of posters and so forth around, quite a lot around the national nodes. Of course, much of this will become available online soon through the OHDSI Europe website and so forth. So if you want to look at more details related to a number of the countries I mentioned and a few more who are really kind of self-organizing, as I say, around these national nodes, these national networks, including colleagues that presented also from South Korea here as well, but also, mostly European countries too as well. Then look out for that on the OHDSI Europe website in due course when all this becomes available, as I say, online. There were a number of posters around data standards and management, in fact, a very large section, as it were, within this. And I think really looking at, again, a lot of experiences around mapping to the common data model in different data sets, whether that's in UK, I mentioned already, Ukraine and so forth as well. One thing that really came out, mentioned in the earlier tour around Europe, but also in a lot of the posters, is around vocabulary mappings and vocabulary extensions. For instance, our Norwegian colleagues had to create bespoke vocabularies, of course, for some of the pregnancy concepts. Not unusual, but clearly in a lot of specialized areas, and we see a lot of this across some of these posters and so forth, and some of these groups, and the need to use both standardized but also new concepts and vocabulary extensions and so forth. And this is a really burgeoning and growing area, as I think everyone's aware, in terms of work and expectation and workload as well. But some of these posters, I think, are very good insights into those areas, for instance, as well. And then, jumped up in. Yeah, analytics development, a lot around well, the aforementioned Eden portal and the roadmap, as it were, a lot around dashboards and visualization of data sets being fed again by OMOP map data sets around European countries and so forth. A shout out here for our colleagues at Eden's Health. It's a certified SME, Jared and Lars. Fantastic poster around. For some of you may be familiar with Raspberry Pi, which is the very low cost computing hardware platform, $50, $100 for a small ARM based computer. And they were loading up OHDSI software tools, Atlas and many others, onto Raspberry Pis as a demonstration. But actually, again, in low and middle income countries, it would be phenomenal to be able to have a series of these Raspberry Pis available for training and education of colleagues in, say, sub-Saharan African countries or in Southeast Asia or other places. You won't be able to work with very large data sets within this kind of hardware, but you could use, synthetic data sets or very small data sets mapped to the common data model and so forth, learn how to use a lot of the tools and so forth and skills-based approach with a very inexpensive hardware and in terms of cost, but also they'd run a number of Dockerized environments and so forth, so very quick to deploy environments within this kind of hardware. And it really points to the future, I think, of these kind of innovations, which again just expand the potential for other colleagues who have yet not been exposed to working within the OHDSI research framework, CDM, and the tools, but could quite rapidly get up to speed in doing so in using these science approaches. So I just want to point that one out because I think it was fascinating from an innovation point of view, as it were, as well. And then some more complex aspects, as it were, around some of the tooling and so forth as well. Number of software demonstrations. Our colleagues from Odysseus, particularly around the Arachne tool or a bidirectional node. In terms of federated study execution, so forth as well, and then particular area around data visualization in using cancer and oncology data, and of course a big area of work within OHDSI, a big area of expectation in terms of complex multidimensional data, omics and so forth as well. And then a few other aspects, just wrapping up soon in terms of time, various posters around the clinical applications, and this is fascinating, because there's a lot of work in terms of, obviously in terms of characterization, effective estimation studies, but also really taking a lot of this information to the clinical coalface, as it were, to the bedside. And so again, reinforcing that that we will potentially or can have an impact in the work that's being conducted out, today, in understanding and insights in terms of how we're managing multiple numbers of diseases internationally in different populations and in different countries and so forth as well. And one to point out, for instance, is I think Chenyanova and others from Israel, and looking at this large-scale inflammatory bowel disease characterization study, as it were. But more of these, I'm sure, will follow as we have now large-scale networks globally, literally globally in multiple regions, where we can really see very large-scale characterization studies giving us a lot of insights into all sorts of communicable and non-communicable diseases over time, but really a lot in terms of clinical, public health, and so forth as well. So from fascinating kind of areas. And then there was quite a number of aspects around methodological research as well, in terms of, again, everything from kind of risk factors and prediction and so forth, as it were. Quite a lot of number of studies around prediction modeling and so on, but also in terms of aforementioned a few posters around health technology assessment I alluded to earlier, and also linked to things like predictive modeling, again, as it were, in the case of Henrik Johns and others, again, in Peter's group, around dementia, as it were, but also, again, no surprise, quite a number of things related to COVID-19, whether that's in terms of disease or indeed vaccine. So watch out for all these posters and a few more that I don't have time to go through. Just very quickly mention there was a number of papers in the last part of the symposium really focusing on COVID-19, the very largest study of its kind, looking at adverse events driven by Erica Voss and others, as she presented in terms of characterizing adverse events in COVID-19 infected patients. Darwin EU, and Peter's obviously director of the coordinating centre at Erasmus for the new regulatory network being driven by the European Medicines Agency, which is key innovation in terms of regulatory science. Also mentioned the early investigators mentor meeting driven by Ross Williams and others, but about 50 registrants were termed themselves as early investigators, and about 18, if I remember rightly, attended this group meeting, which is excellent. And while they look at the needs and requirements, both in terms of being a novice, if you like, to Odyssey, but also training and upskilling and so forth as well for these early investigators. And then Danny drove a whole panel related to kind of a reaction panel, which I think was started in a previous US-based Global Odyssey meeting, but looking at everything from data quality and methodological integrity and challenges of ETLs, regulatory and HTA data, and evidence and methods requirements in a very involved discussion. So that was a lot on day one. Just going to briefly mention the last few points before we finish. A workshop driven by Patrick Ryan, and Erica Voss and others, and Danny Prato, Alhambra, and so forth. But around 150 attendees at Erasmus this time, so not on the ship, but on stable land, looking at a characterization study in myocarditis linked to COVID-19 and also to vaccination. Unfortunately, from basic definitions, particularly around the definition of incidence, through to study design, cohort definition, and evaluation, through to execution in Atlas. What was interesting, and actually I had a very surprised look on Patrick's face, was when he asked a question around use and familiarity of relevant Odyssey tools. The large portion had been using quite a lot of the Odyssey tool set in their own work, and far more than I think we previously anticipated in these types of workshops. So even Patrick, I think, was quite surprised at how many people had come to the workshop and had really had quite a degree of familiarity of the tools, the skills, and the methods that were being described. And then day three were a number of workshops. I think about 75 participants. It kind of thinned out by some days, you can imagine, but all the stalwarts were focused in these work groups in terms of education, with myself, Martijn with Hades, Asya with oncology, and Michael with vocabulary in the morning and in the afternoon, prediction level prediction, OMOP and FIRE with Christian, and ETL and CDM with Eric and with Erica and Maxim. We also had a small PROM specialist interest group out of the Eden collaboration, which met for the first time as well, looking at the vexed issue for patient-reported outcome measures and integration again into things like the CDM, of course, and so on, and into our research stack. So this will be very interesting to see how this develops from a small meeting, which I'm sure will grow from this first start on the third day. So, a few take homes before we finish. Apologies, quite a whirlwind tour of the meeting. Community's growing and diversifying, which is really fantastic to see, and particularly if you look at the difference between pre-pandemic and to where we are now. Many countries are initiating national node development, national networks, which is fantastic. This kind of self-actualizing of Odyssey communities at the grass level is really integral to our sustainability. We're seeing kind of an industrialized ETL process at CDM in Europe, driven by programs like Eden, but not exclusively. Also by a lot of our certified SMEs who have been mapping a lot of their own customer base. And now we're seeing a payoff, I think, in terms of evidence generation that's multiplying, beyond the CDM, as it like. But people are now utilizing these map data sets, but using them to respond to research questions of key interest. There are great insights, I think, from the meeting overall into the positives and challenges of working within the Odyssey research framework, and still lots of work to be done and lots of areas of development and so forth. Clearly, networks like Eden, Darwin EU to come, that's being built out now, but we're already impacting, I think, on the face of European research. And it was really gratifying, I think, to see that within the last those 3 days at the meeting. Expectations are rising considerably with respect to opportunity, I think, to conduct quality research. I think, the genie is out of the bottle, as it were, I think, in terms of people who have been mapping their data sets and are now very hungry to conduct research, but also to do that collaboratively. And then in the last moments, because that leaves us a few moments, as it were, I don't know if this video will work. Let's see. But if you can see this or not, but you'll just see Patrick throwing the microphone, which a few people have never seen before, but some of us, I think, are familiar with this. But the microphone in a kind of comfort square, which can be thrown around, as it were, raised quite a lot of good reaction, actually. But also quite impressive of Patrick's aim of lobbing the microphone in and around the audience during the first day, in particular when there was Q&A. So quite hilarious. I'm going to stop there. I know I've rattled on a long monologue. Apologies. How unusual for me for some time, but I really hope it's given you at least some insights into a wonderful meeting. Again, congratulations to Odyssey Europe, to our Erasmus colleagues in particular who did the bulk of the work in organising this and making it happen. But fantastic also to the whole community that met there on the SS Rotterdam and the Erasmus Medical Centre and did us all proud, I think, in terms of where Odyssey is and where it's going. And importantly, at the end of the day, some really fantastic, excellent, great quality science. I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Craig, for the time. Thank you.
Great, Nigel. Thank you so much. Certainly gets us, I think, hopefully all excited for the global symposium in Bethesda. For anybody who was out there, we had one question on the chat that I believe Erica answered, but Priya asked, "Does the Eden data catalog contain any non-European databases?" I believe that's a no, right?
Well, no, strictly not. I mean, there's some conjecture because it can contain countries like Israel, but we count those as Europe. It's more Eurovision Song Contest Europe than European Union, if you're familiar with that. So generally it's European region, but yes, I think there's a lot of interest outside of Europe from various parts of the world in utilizing maybe the software, or indeed we could see an expansion ultimately into an Odyssey catalog, which would kind of be logical, I suppose.
Right. I mean, Patrick's not on right now, but Odyssey is looking at how to do the next generation of its tracking of its Odyssey databases. So that's in mind.
Great. Thank you, George.
It was a spectacular symposium. Thank you so much. It was so great to be in person again. That made a huge difference. I was very impressive to see all the data sources on the stage at the panel that Nigel described before. For the posters, I found one thing I was impressed with was walking through the posters, like every single poster. Like usually I go through and I see a poster I like and I stop and then I move on a bit. And then I find another poster I like and I look at it. And this time it was like every poster I wanted to read the whole thing. So I found them all very relevant. And as I said, it was just great to be with everybody. And the team did a great job and the ship was very fun. I mean, it was really all good.
Yeah, it seems it's been the most common reaction besides, the quality of the work was just, we worked hard the 2 years of the virtual symposium to try to make it as high quality and as much as we could connect at the time, but certainly there's nothing that matches actually being together. And so the comments about just being able to connect together and walk around and as George said, actually see posters and talk to each other. And, we got some pictures from Martine about the, lunch or networking sessions and things and just the connections that were made. So really exciting to see that. And as I mentioned, it gets certainly gets me more excited for Bethesda in October and hopefully all of you. And judging on the number of submissions we got for the Collaborator Showcase, there is quite a lot of excitement in this community for the symposium in Maryland. I mentioned on the chat, but in case you missed it, recordings, the sessions were recorded. I'm waiting to get them, to get the files, and then we'll upload them as soon as we can. So I'll keep you updated on that so that you can watch all these great presentations that Nigel just talked about. Also, the posters, as I mentioned, we're putting them on our social feeds, but there should be at some point, I think OHDSI Europe might have a page at some point that has all the posters. So as soon as we get all that information, I'll certainly share with any of you. So thank you, Nigel. Thank you to everybody who helped put this symposium on. Thank you to everybody who was part of the symposium. As I mentioned, we will not meet next week. Week after, we'll hopefully hear from a number of new community members and new adopters, and then we'll really start looking forward to our global symposium in Maryland. So thank you everybody for joining. Have a great day. Have a great 2 weeks, and we'll see you July 12th. Thanks everybody. Bye.